Thanks, Ryan, for that great video. So, have any of you ever had this sort of experience? It's Wednesday or Thursday, and you realize as a parent that your kids, haven't really been helping out around the house enough. So you play the card that all parents play, and you yell from the kitchen into the den where they're watching Nickelodeon, and you say, "Kids, go clean your room." And so off they go. We'll use my two children as an example, since I have an illustration of this from the past week in mind. Off they tear to their rooms. Very soon from my daughter's room, you hear the boombox playing at max volume. And screaming out of the speakers is Selena Gomez and Lady Gaga and all other kinds of music that her father associates with terrible music. And she's dancing and she's singing and painting her nails and curling her hair and talking to her new pet fish. And 10 minutes later, you stick your head in her room and it looks the same way. There are clothes all over the floor, and there's bedding for the bed, but it's not on the bed. It's all around the bed. Then there's your son, and he took off like a bullet to his room too. And he too has a boombox in his room, and blaring at over max volume, you hear the strains of Korn and Sum 31 and all other kinds of devilish music that he may or may not have gotten from his father. And 30 seconds later, your son comes screaming out of his room, slides on his knees through the kitchen, and says to you, "I'm done." You're like, "Really? Did you go clean my room, not your room?" And you stick your head in his room, and sure enough, the whole thing is clean. Until you look under his bed. And then there are Legos and underwear and half-eaten apples, all stowed beneath his bed. Same song, different verse. Ever asked your kids to go shovel the snow? No one's had to do this in the last 48 hours. So on the third time yesterday in 48 hours that we had to shovel, I just told my kids to go do it, because I'm a good parent like that. So my kids are out shoveling snow. This is what that means to my kids. My son starts at the top of the driveway with his snow shovel and runs as fast as he can with it on the ground until he plants it into a big pile by the mailbox, and he pole vaults into the street. After watching him do this 3 or 4 times, my older daughter, like the older child would, looks at him and goes, "Eli, would you help out?" Grabs a huge shovel full of snow and throws it at him. At which point they come tearing back into the house to tell Mom and Dad that the shoveling's not going well. My point is that there is the easy way, and then there's the right way. And you who are parents fight that battle with your kids all the time. Let me take you back to something that begins in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5. In the first major event, as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, in his ministry, Jesus, we are told, climbs the side of a hill in northern Israel called Galilee. That's actually the place. And he sits on a hill and he teaches. He preaches a 3-chapter sermon that you and I know as the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. In fact, if you are reading through the Gospel of Matthew with us during the Jesus season, then Matthew 5 is your reading for the next 7 days. It's almost like I planned it that way. Jesus sits on the side of a hill and he teaches. This sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, is very likely the equivalent of what you and I would know in our day and time as Jesus' stump speech. You and I in America are about to go through presidential election season. And those presidential candidates, they all have one speech that they give everywhere they go. It's not Q&A and what they do off the cuff. This is the same thing that they say to everyone regardless of audience. Most people will tell you that's what the Sermon on the Mount is. This is what Jesus taught all the time. Wherever he went, whatever town, he would be sure to preach this sermon. When you think of Jesus, especially as a Christian person, what categories come to mind? Oftentimes in American Christianity, you think of Jesus who died for our sins, or Jesus who was risen from the dead so that he can bring us new life now and later. You think of Jesus, the great servant. You think of Jesus, the lover of sinners and the downtrodden, and all that's true. Too quickly, we don't think of one of the most obvious things that Jesus was, one of the things that would have come to mind immediately for the people of his day and time, which is that Jesus was a teacher. Or, in the language of first century Judaism, he was a rabbi. He was a spiritual teacher. And so he gathered this large group of people in the trodden grass of a hillside in Galilee, and he just taught. Toward the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says these words, from which the entire series derives its name. Verses 13 and 14 of Matthew chapter 7. Jesus says, "Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter that way. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." Jesus is describing this. He's describing the divergence of two paths. Now here's the thing about Jesus, and that sermon in particular. Most of what Jesus says in that sermon, his listeners in his day and time would have picked up on immediately. Jesus was using word pictures and illustrations and examples that would have been readily knowable to his audience in his day. Let me give you a good example, and this picture will help you see it. Do you remember the verses early in Matthew chapter 5 where Jesus says, "You are the light of the world. You are a city set on a hill that cannot be hidden." Well, you see those hills right there in the background around the Sea of Galilee? There was a hill in the first century. There was a city in the first century that sat on top of those hills. And even on the darkest night, it was lit up by torches and lamps and candlelight. So that if you lived in northern Israel around the Sea of Galilee, you knew about this town situated on a hill that you could see at all times. So when Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount from that grassy hillside, all he has to do is point and say, "You, my followers, are to be like that city situated on that hillside that cannot be hidden in night or day." Now here's the thing about these two verses and what it describes. We're not entirely sure what Jesus is driving at. We know that there was something as concrete as that city on a hill that Jesus was referring to. We're just not sure 2,000 years later what it is. Here are some possibilities. The only wide and broad roads in first century Israel would have been the 3 or 4 highways that connected North Israel and South Israel, or North Israel to what is today Syria. And there weren't many of them. They were not paved. At most, they had crushed gravel on them. They were the only 2 or 4 lane roads that would have existed. So there aren't many of them. But there was one in northern Israel that ran to southern Israel. The narrow way, what's he mean by that? Well, here's the best guess. All over Galilee, it's this hilly region centered around that lake from the picture. There were these, what to you and I would only appear to be footpaths that crisscrossed the hills and the Rocky Mountains. And carts, even horses, could not traverse these rocky paths. And it's very likely that when Jesus said, there is this broad, wide way, and there is this narrow way, that the people in his day would have thought of those kinds of images. Now, one more thing about those verses. I told you the Sermon on the Mount is Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Well, you can tell by where this falls. You don't have to be a biblical genius to figure this out. These verses come toward the end of the Sermon on the Mount, which means they're kind of the conclusion to the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is wrapping things up. He's putting a period on the end of the sentence that is the Sermon on the Mount. There is, by the way, if you're familiar with the Sermon on the Mount at all, even if you're not, you may know this story from way back when in Sunday school. There's a parallel passage to this that's about to come, in which, it's actually how the Sermon on the Mount ends. Jesus says to his listeners, make sure you build your life on the rocky ground, so that when the storms come, you don't wash away. Don't be foolish and build on the sandy ground, because when the storm comes, you will. It seems to be that these verses are trying to encapsulate everything that Jesus has said in the Sermon on the Mount. The entire sermon, all 3 chapters, have been about this choice between a wide, broad way and a narrow way. And so you actually know where this series is going to go. For the next few weeks together, what we're going to do is work backward from these verses. And we're going to look at this contrast that Jesus lays out in the Sermon on the Mount. What's normal, what's not. What's the accepted way, what's not. What's Jesus' alternative to what's typical. That's what these verses say. So, imagine yourself sitting on that hillside and you hear these words. What is it exactly that Jesus is driving at? What does he want you, the listener, or you, his student, as your teacher? What's he want you to get? It was very, very simple. Jesus says there are 2 paths, and you have to choose one. There are the paths of life, and there's the path of death. Let's talk about the path of death first. Jesus said that the path of death is wide and broad, and many take it. Right? And it leads them ultimately to destruction. Well, let's expand on that. What do you get from what Jesus is saying? Well, what he means is that there's a way of life that is commonplace. Most everybody does it. There's a way of life that is unquestioned and accepted. Meaning not only do most people do it, they don't think not to do it. It's just the way it is. And this wide, broad road is the way that most people live, Jesus says. And in the end, it destroys you. Now, that word destruction is one of a set of words that Jesus, as well as the rest of your New Testament, as well as going backward into your Old Testament, they use about a way of life. And it's words like destruction and destroy and death. And here's what they mean. They mean something now and they mean something later. They mean it will do you tremendous harm and it will eat away at your life now. And even after your physical death, you will stay that way later. In the Christian faith, we call that hell. You want to know what hell is? It's the continuation of the dead life you're living now. That's how Jesus described it. That's how the rest of the New Testament describes it. Jesus, by the way, here is tapping into a perspective that unites your entire Bible. You can find this way of talking about life all over both Old and New Testament. In fact, he is tapping into a very specific kind of tradition or history from the Old Testament, the wisdom tradition, the wisdom literature. Listen to these proverbs recorded by King Solomon in your Old Testament and see if you don't hear the contrast of Matthew 7, 13, and 14. This is Proverbs chapter 10, verse 16. The price tag of the righteous is life, but the earnings of the wicked are sin and death. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 19, truly the righteous will attain life, but whoever pursues evil finds death. And then this is even the one that's closest yet. Proverbs 14:12. There is a way that appears right, but in the end it leads to destruction. That's exactly what Jesus is saying. There is a way of life that is commonplace, it is unquestioned, it is swallowed hook, line, and sinker by most people, and it's killing them. That's what Jesus was teaching about in the Sermon on the Mount. In his day and time, you'll get to discover over the course of the next few weeks what exactly he means. Here are some of the things that he means for the listeners in his day and time. He would mean that they were immersed, all of his listeners were immersed in a religious system that encouraged them to try to earn enough favor with God for him to finally bless them. Their entire religious system was based on that premise. Work hard enough for God, he will bless you in the end. If you don't work hard enough, or you sin too often, then he will curse you. That's first century Judaism in a nutshell. Jesus was fighting against that unquestioned, accepted premise. He was fighting against people. He was fighting against a culture and a religious system both, where there was a huge gap between the haves and the have-nots. Those who should be thought well of, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious leaders, most of whom who were rich, and then everybody else who were told explicitly and implicitly, you can't measure up. This is what Jesus was combating. This is part of what his hearers would have heard when he said to them, there is a way that is broad and wide, and it's accepted by everybody. and it destroys you in the end. These are the things that would have popped for them. I am much more intrigued, though, in thinking about this for us. We who are Christians take Jesus to be, among many other things, our teacher. He is the one who gives us truth. He is the one who is our spiritual chiropractor, and he puts our life back into line. We finally see things the right way when we see things his way. So let's think about this for us. If Jesus is right, then we should be able to pause, and we should be able to see in our lives and in our culture a way of life that is commonplace and accepted and unquestioned. And almost everybody does it without thinking. And we should be able to observe that that way of life is killing them. It is eroding who they are as human beings. Now, when I say that, what do you think of? This is not where we start to pick on, as Christian people, all our little pet sins in other people that we don't like. Those things don't qualify. They don't fit that bill. I'm talking about ways of living that are accepted and normative, and that most people without thinking buy into, but that are exceedingly detrimental to them and to the others around them. Well, in preparing for this, over the last couple of weeks, I've kind of been on a quest to just observe life and our culture from this perspective over the last couple of weeks. And while you think about what you see in our culture and in our shared life together in West Michigan or America or wherever that fits that bill, let me tell you some of what I saw. As I worked and surfed the internet and watched television and talked to people at Big B, I observed a culture that is exceedingly trivial. Exceedingly trivial. I was made to believe by television commercial after television commercial or Facebook ad that popped up in the right column of my Facebook page that if I just bought the new iPad, I'd be happy. And I'd have friends, because God knows you can't have friends if you can't post to your Facebook page while driving down M6 from your iPad. I've been led to believe by the advertisers, by the commentators, that the things that matter most are superficial in the end. It is said that during their formative years of elementary school and secondary education, children in our culture are bombarded by at least several thousand of these messages every day. And it's all about what you need and what you don't have so that you can finally be happy. And everybody believes it. I do. I look forward to the day when I can finally have a new car. And I think that somehow that's going to make me happy. I look forward to the day where I can have this or that from my wish list, and I think that finally I'll be happy. I think, oh man, if I only had a better job. Obviously, this is hypothetical. I love my job. If I only finish my degree and get a better job, then I will be happy. And what I'm telling you is that's the broad and wide way that Jesus was talking about. It's trivial. It is superficial. And you and I live in a culture that is teaching us to be trivial. And it's killing us. You want to know why we're so unhappy? because the things we say are important aren't. And the things we all say that we want, we won't do. We would much rather be trivial instead. We are, in the great phrase of the Christian writer Frederick Buechner, killing time before time kills us. That's American culture. Which leads me, by the way, to another observation that I made about the culture in which we live and the broad and wide road that it offers that no one questions. We're duplicitous. You know what that word means? I didn't grab it off my word-a-day calendar. Duplicitous. We say one thing and we do another. We as a culture seem to have this obsession. It can be about politics, can be about social issues. It shows up all over the place. We have this obsession with being right. And we have to be right for the right reasons. And so we will talk long and hard about these things that we believe and we hold dear, and God help you if you disagree with us. The problem is we don't live according to the beliefs that we say that we hold dear. I had a conversation in the last 2 weeks with somebody who was opining to me how much that they did not like the way that the economic situation in this country was, and that the 1% were somehow lording it over the 99%, and I'll leave it to you to decide whether or not you think that's true. But in continuing to talk with this person, I realized, what they really mean is they're not happy in the job they have, and they can't buy enough of that trivial stuff for them to be happy. And so they'd like to blame somebody else for their misery. And more to the point, this person who was talking at length about all those terrible people who won't lift a finger to help somebody else isn't doing a darn thing to help anybody. That's duplicitous. And we live in a culture that works that way. Who you say you are is different than the person you really are in America. This is why we're all surprised when the latest public figure, be it an actress or a political leader, you find out, oh my gosh, behind closed doors, their life is a soap opera. It is an unmitigated disaster. That's because we love to be focused on what people say and say with great passion, and we do not care how they actually live in private. This duplicity is inherently American. It's also inherently human. That's the wide and broad accepted way that everybody does. That's what Jesus would have gone after if he'd have preached this sermon in our day and time. Want a couple more real fast? This is what I have observed about the wide and broad way of America. We are obsessed with our bodies. Obsessed. I mean two things by that. Number one, if you are not pretty and or handsome or working on it to fit the cultural norm of whatever that is, then you're worthless. And two, different, if your body tells you to do it, do it. If you have an urge or a need and your body says do it, then in our culture, you know what you're told to do? Do it, and do it with gusto. That is not the biblical way of viewing our relationship with our bodies in either case. This is the wide and broad accepted way of American culture, and it's killing us. One more. We are, and this has been a matter of academic validation for decades now. You and I happen to live in what is inarguably at this point the most individualistic culture that has ever been seen on the face of the globe. And what I mean by that is your life is your life and my life is my life, and never the two shall meet. We do not think, as is said in Genesis chapter 4, that we are our brother's keeper. And so we talk a good game about sharing and loving and friendship, and yet we live in this silo culture, isolated from one another. It's all smoke and mirrors. It is all trivia. Over and over you have conversations, or you see shows, or you see commercials about things that really matter, like relationships and love. And it's all for show, because none of us are doing it. We all go about our lives isolated and alone, carrying our own burdens, making our own way. This is the wide and broad way of our culture that nobody questions, but Jesus would. And it's killing us. You want to know who you're going to be after you die? We all have those questions about the afterlife and what it is. Well, here's the Christian perspective. If you're an American and you're buying hook, line, and sinker into all that stuff that I just said, and if you don't like any of what I just said, fine, you fill in the blank. I trust Jesus. I think he's correct. That there is, no matter what culture you're in, a wide and accepted norm that nobody questions. And it's killing everybody. But whatever it is, if you're an American and you're living according to that wide and broad way, this normative way, not only is it eroding and poisoning your life now, it's exactly what you will be after you die. That's the Christian perspective. It destroys you now, and it's exactly what the afterlife looks like later. That's the Christian definition of hell. If you're curious about hell, there's actually a message from this last summer's What's Up With That series. You can find it on the CD rack back there, where we go into much more detail about it. So if that's one half of it, here's the other half. So there is this commonplace way that destroys you that nobody questions. And then Jesus says there is the other way. There is the way that leads to life. Life, like destruction, is a comprehensive term. It does not just mean now. It does not just mean after you die in heaven. It means both. You start it now, you culminate it later. And what's Jesus say about this alternative that he is laying out for people? He says it is not common. It is not accepted, so much so that most people won't do it or won't find it. There is a narrow way. And like those rocky paths, as opposed to the smooth highways that crisscross the Galilean hillside, it's not easy. But the end result is life. Perhaps you with me will look at that and you will say to yourself, wow, I'm not sure we talk about that Jesus a whole lot. We talk about the Jesus who loves us and who forgives us and opens his arms to all comers and all peoples, no matter what shape or size or color they may be. And all that's true. So's this. The Jesus who wants to grab you by the scruff of the neck and shake you awake. And in this case, he wants to tell you, you need to wake up and figure out that what you're being told by the culture in which you live is a lie. And it's killing you. And you think that it's going to give you happiness and life, and it's only going to tear you down in the end. But there's a better way. And he lays out that better way in the course of the Sermon on the Mount, the verses that Matthew 7, 13, and 14 wrap up. And we'll talk about those over the course of the series. First, however, at least notice that most people are not inclined to do it his way. In fact, he says that few people will find it. Few people will find this way of life. That means you may need to be prepared to do some things or make some decisions or reorder your life in a way that some people, maybe even a lot of the people around you, won't understand. They're not going to agree with it. They're not going to understand it because they are blinded by the norm of what's out there. Jesus says, no, my way's better. You'll find life. Be prepared to have few travelers with you. You also need to know that it should be fairly easy to diagnose that you need what Jesus is offering. Here's why. He says his way offers you life, as opposed to what you may be currently experiencing, which is in his word, destruction. So at the very least, what you can do is say to yourself, truth be told, all my cards on the table, being completely honest before, if no one else, myself and God Almighty, I am not that happy. I am not that content. I am one of those trivial, duplicitous, self-absorbed, individualistic people. I get it. That's me. I don't want it anymore. I want something better. I want something different. I want what the dreams and cry of my soul in the quiet of the night tell me that they want. I want life. I want life the way that God intended it to be. Then you're ready for the hard way, if that's where you find yourself. Be prepared. This is why God's people in the New Testament, those who follow Jesus, are called, among other things, exiles. They are called by Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2 of his letter. They are called exiles and aliens and strangers in a foreign land because we do things the hard way. We do things Jesus' way. We do things the narrow way. We don't do things the way everybody else does. And we get it. That makes us strange. Can you think of some of the things? Now, again, we're going to cover this over the course of the series, but just think for a minute. Some of the things that Jesus asks that may be hard, but they give you life in the end. Over the course of the Sermon on the Mount, he's going to ask you to be someone, for instance, who loves your enemies and forgives them. He's going to be someone who asks you to trust God Almighty to take care of your tangible physical needs, not other people. That way, you can invest yourself and your time and your resources into other people and into kingdom work. That's the Jesus way. That's the hard way. He's going to ask you to be a peacemaker, to be meek and to be mild, to be gentle. That's the hard way. He's going to ask you to have a spirituality. This is the beginning of Matthew chapter 6. He's going to ask you to have a spirituality that you don't do for other people. You're not trying to be seen and approved by other people. You're going to do it in private. Because in private, God is the one who affirms you and encourages you in what you're doing. That's the hard way. He's going to ask you not to judge other people. Moreover, he's going to ask you to realize about yourself that the reason you don't judge other people is because you realize you have major faults of your own. And who are you to pick on other people? That's the beginning of Matthew chapter 7. This is the hard way. It's the only way you're ever going to find life worth living. That's what Jesus says. Here's how the Sermon on the Mount ends. Very quickly after those verses. When Jesus finished this teaching, the crowd that was gathered around him was amazed by what he said. Because he taught as someone who had real spiritual authority, not like their usual religious teachers. Today, and over the course of this series, you will be put in the position of the crowd. Today, and over the course of this series, you will hear Jesus teach like no one else you've ever heard in your life teach. He will say things and guide us into things that no one else would. And then you will be left with the crowd to ask, what do I do with this Jesus? He is striking. He is amazing. He is unlike any other voice I've ever heard. Now what do I do with Jesus? And you really have two choices. You can keep on the wide and broad way that you've been going, the unquestioned way that the world around you is telling you to live, or you can stop and you can find the hard way that alone leads to life, real life. And in the end, that actually comes down to the second question on the screen, which is a question of trust. Brennan Manning, the great Christian writer of our day, who probably maybe better than any writer in the last 50 years, has given us extraordinary books on the subject of forgiveness and grace. In his book called Ruthless Trust, says that in the end, for all people, we will have to ask and answer the question of who do we trust? Who do you trust with your life? The whole thing. Who do you trust to be your guide in the decisions that you need to make? Who do you trust to help you set the priorities that you need to in life? Who do you trust to tell you what to do, to tell you how to behave? Who do you trust? People in the crowd that day, just like people here today, will decide that the voice that they trust, even if they don't have the gall to say it out loud, is themselves. In the end, I am going to do what I personally want to do, or what is best for me, or what keeps me out of somebody else's crosshairs the most. That's one choice. The other choice that many people make is that they, maybe even unbeknownst to them, are trusting the culture around them to guide them. They take their values and what they should care about from all the voices around them. That's who they trust. And Brennan Manning says, for the Christian person, for the person who encounters Jesus and listens to Jesus and hears Jesus for who he is, the only answer to that question is, I will trust Jesus with my life. Because it is only through him that I find the hard way, that is in the end the better way, that is in the end the only way to live a life worth living. So I ask you today, who are you trusting? Who are you trusting with your life?